All right. Welcome everybody to night two in the second week of our spring member lecture series as we continue on with Dr. Greg Beaman, Georgetown University. But also an area that he's focused on, and he'll talk also some more about, especially next week, mostly Greg, right? Yeah. But if you ever have a time, go ahead and he has a long working relationship. Actually, you actually have a title. You're the historian?
Director of Research.
Director of research. And honestly, I put all of that last week when I was like seeing all the locations and dots. I was like, oh, that's the guy to have in charge of the research for sure, who can kind of focus in on those areas. But it's the Claiborne Avenue History Project. The website is claiborneavenue.wordpress.com. And if you just Google Claiborne Avenue History Project, there's a lot of amazing stuff on there. It's a great program similar to the Friends of the Cabildo Oral History program, and this is on Claiborne Avenue. So before next week, take a look at the Claiborne Avenue History Project's webpage, and I think you'll get a lot of interest out there. I spent a couple hours messing around on it late last week, so I hope you'll take advantage of that. But tonight, Greg is going to continue on, and we're going to be talking about rival soundscapes of Civil War New Orleans. Absolutely fantastic topic that I am interested to find out what that actually means. So, with that, I want to welcome Greg Beaman back for his second night, and thank you so much, Greg, for being here tonight.
All right, thank you, Jason. Again, really an honor to be here. I really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for coming out. Great to see some folks tuning in. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. New Orleans is a city filled with generations of multilingual speakers, long traditions of multicultural music making, and a pattern of urban development that entrenched slavery and its legacies into the built environment. Tonight, my research is going to try to decode some of these soundscapes and to integrate my research into cultures of sound and music in the city, into the other research I talked about last week about the legacies of slavery as seen in rival geographies of the urban environment. The evidence I'll review today points to close ties between the musical world of the Civil War, the political and social debates about emancipation, and the wisdom of putting freed people, former slaves, into battle on the side of the Union. Now, the history of New Orleans teems with examples of rival soundscapes, and upon scrutiny, we'll find close relationships between sound and the urban landscape. Rival soundscapes are just the ways that sounds can denote different things to different people. Sound and music, and the ways that people from different backgrounds, and especially in this era of a different free status, whether free or enslaved, heard their built environment. Now, during the Civil War and following the abolition of slavery, thousands of freed people departed the Louisiana plantation landscape and headed to New Orleans in a migration that would last for decades. African Americans who arrived in New Orleans during the late 19th century brought with them the blues, both as a musical form and as a way of living and knowing and perceiving the world around them. Creoles of color had long nurtured their own musical traditions inside the city and the faubourgs, playing for dances, balls, society parties, and in honky-tonks, dives, and brothels. Now, gradually, as French-speaking and English-speaking African Americans staked out urban geographies to call their own, these competing musical traditions fused into jazz. And as jazz exploded into a global music, New Orleans musicians continued innovating new styles, particularly rock and roll and rhythm and blues. But because of the eras of early jazz and early 20th century, and especially rhythm and blues and rock and roll later in the 20th century have really been studied in great depth, I've tried to seek origins for these rival soundscapes in the Civil War and Reconstruction. And the clarinetist and historian Dr. Michael White argues, pull up this
I think
video.
that sense was an important entity that fulfilled two functions. One, the traditional need for celebration and danceable, fun music, but also it was a metaphor for the type of American democracy, democratic ideal that African Americans were fighting for in the courts in everyday life. So the music.
I'm gonna rewind that. It said my screen sharing was paused, so I'm gonna try to get that going again so we can hear this.
Yeah, definitely.
Jazz, in a sense, was an important entity that fulfilled two functions. One, the traditional need for celebration and danceable, fun music, but also it was a metaphor for the type of American democracy, democratic ideal that African Americans were fighting for in the courts in everyday life. So the music emphasized both individuality and collectivism. And in a way, I think it was a means of combating the socially imposed invisible status of black people. It came together for me.
All right, could everybody hear that?
Yes, we can hear that. You can hear it well.
Okay, I think the you didn't need to see it, but all right, I'll move on. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So White points out that the musicians most associated with early jazz in New Orleans experienced the same conditions of like the late 1870s, 1880s, this Reconstruction era that produced the Plessy versus Ferguson case, to which in 1890, the U.S. Supreme Court gave states the authority to segregate public places according to race. But what about that generation's parents? What was the cultural soundscape and the musical life of that generation, the generation who experienced emancipation firsthand? In other words, how did the generation of the 1860s use music and sound to claim the urban environment? And how were those expressions countered and contested by other New Orleanians? Now, none other than Sidney Bechet, the other great clarinetist, left us a detailed and heartfelt description of the music his own father passed down about the era of emancipation. In his 1960 autobiography, Bechet writes, "There was this big change. A different feeling had got started. The lyrics to the song, 'Go Down Moses, Way Down in Egypt Land, Tell Old Pharaoh to Let My People Go,' it was years they'd been singing that, and suddenly there was a different way of singing it. You could feel a new happiness in the lines. All that waiting, all that time when the song was far off music, suffering music, and all at once it was there, it had arrived. It was joy music now. It was free day, emancipation. And New Orleans just bust wide open. A real time was had. They heard the music, and the music told them about it. They heard that music from bands marching up and down the streets, and they knew what music it was. It wasn't spirituals or blues or ragtime, but everything all at once, each one putting something over on the other." Bechet continues, "Some of those people didn't even know what emancipation was. I do find that hard to believe, but they just knew there was a hell of a parade going on, a whole lot of laughing and singing, a whole lot of music being happier than the music that had ever been before." So there's this joy around emancipation that's expressed musically, and it's expressed in sounds in the street and being loud and raucous. And in New Orleans, though, as elsewhere in the country, the joy of emancipation was countered by the material conditions faced by the newly freed people. New Orleans started out as a Confederate city, but the Union Army recaptured the city from the rebels in April 1862. And soon tens of thousands of the enslaved laborers on Deep South cotton and sugar plantations left the lives of drudgery for the protection of federal troops behind Union lines in the city. Based on the prevailing theory that these individuals were, quote, illicit property, they became known as contrabands. Now, the term contraband had been around a while to describe illicit property, but it took on new meanings during the Civil War when General Benjamin Butler began to use the term to designate newly self-freed people as seized property, a legal gambit that permitted him to use their labor for the Union war effort. Contraband songs, then, these were the first songs sang by freed people that could have been referencing their new political status. And this started in Port Royal, Virginia, in the Sea Islands off the coast of Georgia and South Carolina, where Benjamin Butler started these experiments with wartime labor. Northerners, primarily white middle-class evangelical Protestants, flocked to the region as part of nascent recovery efforts and began publishing accounts of life among the contrabands, including their songs and music. Surprisingly, these songs are little studied. But Michael C. Cohen, a literary historian, has mapped the spread of these songs along with the spread of emancipation. And he writes that these songs, these contraband songs, map the geography of wartime culture and politics, and particularly map the emergence of emancipation as the dominant rationale for the Civil War after 1861. Cohen, in particular, shows how and when the quasi-enslaved, quasi-free people first got word of their newfound freedom. A number of contraband songs came out of New Orleans, and as expected, their meanings varied according to the performance and the performers. The publisher A.E. Blackmar in New Orleans published several. Blackmar published "We Are Coming, Father Abraham," and credited it to an intelligent contraband. In May 1863, Blackmar published "The Contraband Schottische" by Charles Young. It's an instrumental work, so we can't really ascribe meaning to it without an inscription. I'd like to learn more about Young. I'm working on that. But another version of the Schottische, this time attributed to Septimus Winter, but with it's the same song, has a cover that makes clear the author and maybe even the publisher are not fighting for emancipation. Blackmar also published songs from the North, like Pompey's Contraband Song by the New York composer J. Ward Childs. Now, publishing this tune put into local circulation a song touching on local issues, but composed from afar. In the person of Pompey, which was a stereotypical name for an enslaved man, Childs sang, "I'm a contraband darky and came from the South. When I left Lincoln's soldiers all down in the mouth of the old Mississippi with them air machines, which the next day they sailed up to Orleans." Now, this song fits the category of a unionist pro-emancipation song. Childs did rely on the conventions of minstrelsy to draw listeners in, but then made a strong political statement in favor of African-American freedom and even using Black troops to fight in the Civil War. In the first verse of Pompey's Contraband Song, the singer introduces himself, but then the verses continue. He goes, "My master skedaddled when Farragut came for fear of the Yankees, and I did the same. But soon I discovered they were fighting for me, for the black population, that they might be free. The white people fancied that we could not fight, but they saw their mistake when they gave us a sight. For in the great charge of the colored brigade was the boldest, they say, that ever was made." This song rehearses the recent local events that had great national significance. In other words, Admiral Farragut breaking through the rebel defenses at the mouth of the Mississippi River and steaming up the river to secure the region for federal forces. Highlights the promise of emancipation and even gets to this idea of drafting Black troops for the Union war effort. So one thought that always comes to my mind when I'm reading through all of these lyrics and trying to get a sense of some of these songs is that they're definitely not written by enslaved people. And sometimes the authors aren't even sympathetic to the plight of the formerly enslaved like Childs was. But when we think about the circumstances of their performance, we know that the audiences would have included both free and enslaved people, whether they were performed in concert halls, saloons, at home in the parlor, by the fireside, or sung in the streets. And so some of these songs became songs of emancipation. And in taking these songs away from their public performances, it gave people the opportunity to remake the songs for themselves. Now, these are a few of the hundreds of songs I've read lyrics to and listened to some recordings of over the last year or more, as I'm trying to build out this Rival Soundscapes project. But one of the problems I'm facing is that there's not a lot of recordings of these. Sometimes there's only sheet music, or at best, a MIDI arrangement where someone's just scanned the notes in and the computer plays it back. We don't really have recordings because these entertainments happened at the exact moment that sound recording technology was being invented in the 1860s. But even though it was invented in the 1860s, it's still a few decades before it takes hold. So I've taken it upon myself to perform some of these songs so I can at least have a melody in my head and in my ears when I'm trying to analyze them. And here's one of those contraband songs that I've done this with, the Contraband's Quick Step. It's just an instrumental melody so far as I've uncovered, and it starts there below the F, the forte symbol, in the middle of the top line. So speak up if you can't hear this. Maybe I should have taken quick step more literally there. I'll try that next time. So this song didn't have a very wide circulation, but I can without a doubt place the song in New Orleans in 1863. The melody is in Elias Howe's Fife Without a Master, which was this collection of melodies. It's almost a lesson book, and just popular melodies put together, intended for students, performers, military musicians. It was published in Cincinnati in 1863. Now, I found a copy of this book in the Peter Marks Minstrelsy Collection at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Now, a little bit about Marks real fast, because he's going to be in New Orleans. Marks was born in 1843, grew up in Cincinnati, where he learned to play piano, harp, and guitar. During the Civil War, he served a stint as a member in an Ohio militia before leaving to continue his music career. One of the premier minstrel troops of the era, the Monitor Campbell Minstrels, hired Marks to go on tour along the Mississippi River. Now, we know this is a we know this was a Unionist group because they've got the name Monitor in their name, referencing this already famous naval battle from the James River when the Monitor and the Merrimack clashed early in the Civil War, the Monitor being the Union ship. And the band stayed in Union territory throughout this tour. Now, they did several shows in Natchez during the fall of 1863, right as Ulysses S. Grant's establishing his headquarters there after conquering Vicksburg. But the troops' itinerary found them in New Orleans during Thanksgiving 1863. This is the year that Abraham Lincoln declared a national day of Thanksgiving as part of the war effort. Now, Marks was something of a pack rat, and we're fortunate that his descendants saved his stuff, and they donated it to the Smithsonian just a few years ago. As Marks kept the posters advertising his shows. And with these posters, which aren't available anywhere else, set lists aren't included in the newspapers. The only reason we have these set lists of songs performed in New Orleans during Thanksgiving 1863 is because Mark saved them and his descendants donated them. But I've been able to use these to put together full set lists of the performances in New Orleans and Natchez. Now, these set lists show a musical group trying to make sense of the revolutionary changes of emancipation, the Civil War, and especially addressing this controversial idea of Black military service. The history of the United States colored troops has been told quite a bit, more so lately, but I just want to give a quick rundown of what it looked like in New Orleans. There's a group of freedmen of color at the outset of the Civil War who called themselves the Louisiana Native Guards. Now, they volunteered to serve the Confederacy to defend the city, their homes, and their families. And this type of service had a very long tradition in Louisiana. Many people know about the free colored militias during the Spanish period, free men of color fighting during the Battle of New Orleans, and enslaved people fighting. during the War of 1812, and even in the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. But when Farragut and Butler retook the city for the Union in 1862, these Louisiana Native Guards volunteered for the Union. Butler accepted their service and eventually raised 3 regiments, relying on the Second Confiscation Act and his experience with contrabands in Port Royal the year before. But let's be clear, the Louisiana Native Guards were never fought for the Confederacy and were never in the Confederate Army. But as far as the songs go, we get this idea of rival soundscapes. At Natchez on November 9th, the group performed Collision on the Underground Railroad, and they played a song called The Black Brigade, songs which they would repeat in New Orleans during their week's worth of shows at the Masonic Hall on St. Charles Street over Thanksgiving. On November 23rd, they played a song, The Raw Recruits, another tune lampooning black soldiers. The Collision on the Underground Railroad is about this quickly disappearing route to freedom, as the existence of tens of thousands of contrabands in the city attested. But is it disappearing? Because there's no need to have these barriers anymore. And in the city, the bonds of enslavement were dissolving as well. Another troupe, Dupre and Green's New Orleans and Metropolitan Minstrels and Brass Band, also performed the famous Raw Recruits around Christmas 1862 at the Academy of Music right across Masonic Hall right across St. Charles Street from the Masonic Hall. And this song, it suggests to me the competing interpretations of popular music during these years. The lyrics themselves are very staunchly pro-Union and not on their face related to the formation of the United States colored troops. Here are the lyrics. They say we have no officers, but they are mistaken. And soon you'll see the rebels run with all the fuss they're making. The man who would these states divide should hang for his suggestion. One country and one flag, I say, whoe'er the war may slaughter. I'm going up to Washington to fight for Abraham's daughter. But then we get this frontispiece showing a barely put together regiment of black troops. Then there's the Black Brigade. Despite this anodyne, very basic cover, this one had far less ambiguous lyrics. The song's written in dialect, and it portrays African soldiers as cowards and tools of Northern abolitionists. But just as an aside, there's this reference to James River oysters, which James River in Virginia, which situates the origins of this song in Virginia. But I wonder if any of these performers threw in any references to Gulf oysters. We know oysters were a big deal even back then. So if you heard my talk last week, you heard me say towards the end that the tools of resistance were built into the urban environment. I just want to explain a little bit more about what that means. The overarching point is that the urban environment means different things to different people. Before emancipation, free status had a major bearing on how someone viewed their physical surroundings. This is what I call the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery spatial imaginations. With the abolition of slavery, though, the formerly enslaved and the people who had been known as free people of color before the war, generations removed from slavery, they set themselves to the task of remaking these spatial imaginations in their everyday lives. And so we start to see expressions of the spatial imagination of emancipation. And the exact same city that kept the enslaved in their proper spheres of belonging then could also hold places of refuge and eventually freedom. This is how resistance is built in to the built environment, because it depends on who's experiencing the built environment. This depends on who's making their way. So one of these places that meant something different depending on one's free status was the Toro Almshouse on Charter Street between Piety and Desire. One of the members of the Louisiana Native Guards, United States Colored Troops, was a free man of color named Francis Dumas. He wrote, "No matter where I fight, I only wish to spend what I have and fight as long as I can. If only my boy may stand in the street equal to a white boy when the war is over." Can't be more clear than that. Some of these men are fighting for the right to exist and function in public space on the same terms as anyone else. Here's a little zoom up. For all we know, Francis Dumas could be one of these men standing outside the barracks. But trying to discover what this place sounded like based on documentary evidence has been very difficult. But this is why I'm resounding some of these tunes. This is why I'm trying to get a better sense of the music and these cultures of sound. And another one of the melodies from Elias Howe's Fife Without a Master that Peter Marks had with him in New Orleans was the Black Brigade Camp Dance. This isn't the same song as the Black Brigade from earlier. This is the Black Brigade Camp Dance, kind of showing even more how these themes of tunes stood out. And I've also resounded this song. Here I am on trumpet. Now, this is a fairly straightforward bugle call. And it might have even been played on a cornet in the 1860s. Definitely wouldn't have been played on a B-flat trumpet. People just weren't playing B-flat trumpets then. But I have to ask, might the musical life of the United States colored troops included a song just like this that they claimed as their own? Now, the musical styles of Black soldiers in New Orleans probably did have elements that we can consider and characterize as explicitly African. Two men in the 2nd Regiment of the Native Guards, Wimba Congo and August Congo, had only arrived in the U.S. from Congo in 1859, victims of an illegal slave voyage. One contemporary account suggests that the two recruits were soon regaling their comrades with stories of ancestors in Africa, their customs, their tribes, and their kings. So to me, it isn't hard to imagine Wimba's and August's knowledge extending to their musical traditions. And I want to know what that looked like. Mentions of the military music of the Native Guards, though, that I have found suggest it may have stuck more closely to national patriotic traditions. When the Black regiments paraded through the streets of New Orleans, the papers report they did so with flags flying, drums beating, and the band playing Yankee Doodle. Now, the unit mustered out at the conclusion of the war, the men celebrated by marching around the city and the faubourgs, stopping at favorite locations for drinks and camaraderie, sort of prototypical second line. The October 24th, 1865 issue of the New Orleans Tribune, which was the first Black-owned newspaper in the city, tells that the soldiers paraded with fife and drums to the office of the Tribune, where the men stopped and gave 3 cheers. Now, I bet they played the songs over and over and over again. And the music of this parade and the Emancipation Day parades are just the sort of songs that Sidney Bechet's father told him about growing up. I want to talk a little bit more about this almshouse. In September 1865, emancipation had a short history in New Orleans, but it turned violent and explosive very quickly. And both sounds and silences played into the volatility. Even before the Toro Barracks housed Black Union soldiers, it was the site of a freedmen's hospital and drew the ire of the neighborhood of Confederate sympathizers. Throughout the summer and fall of 1862, newspapers reported that, quote, "Our Negroes are becoming uncommonly wayward and unruly," and bemoaned the ill treatment of white men and women by those now quartered at the Toro almshouse. As winter set in, they complained of the, quote, "terribly destitute conditions of the almshouse, and of that pest house of contrabands, where so many runaways have shuffled off the mortal coil." As the laws and social customs that preserved bondage were breaking down all around them, These Confederates are clinging to the old order. They're clinging to the pro-slavery spatial imagination. But when persuasion failed, someone turned to arson. The results of a subsequent investigation pinned responsibility for the fire at the almshouse. Here's the almshouse burned down. The investigation pinned responsibility for the improper use of the ventilation ducts as chimneys, but many witnesses to the fire stated their initial belief that an arsonist had started it. First Lieutenant S.A. Newman, who was in Company B of the 81st United States Colored Infantry, was one of the soldiers guarding the barracks that night, and he recalled members of the guard have reported to the captain that they had heard passersby frequently remark that they wished the building was in hell so they could get the damned N-word out. Cannot account for the fire except as the work of an incendiary. Union troops also accused the police of failing to raise the alarm of the fire, of silencing. So while beginning to fight the fire, Captain Smiley, in charge of the troops, had to send his own men out to raise the alarms. And he said he did not hear the alarm of fire given by the policemen as I expected I would. Yet simultaneously, the last years of the war and the certainty of emancipation marked a moment of as great a jubilee as we can probably imagine, one that was long in the making. The celebrations of freedom, though, came with many sounds and songs. A grand Free State demonstration and torchlight procession in February 1864 contained no fewer than 8 brass bands celebrating the Union. But when the State Constitutional Convention agreed in May 1864 to include the abolition of slavery in the state constitution, there was a grand emancipation jubilee accompanied by military bands. And the music played in cabarets, pleasure gardens, and music halls continued these developments. But there's this other element, one more element, the solemnity of religious music that was performed for emancipation. It's not really received much attention at all. There was a large congregation of freed people and free people of color who attended the Holy Name of Jesus Church, which was at the corner of Ursulines and Claiborne on the downriver side. It's a humble building. For each moment of citywide celebration over emancipation, the congregation of this church held religious services featuring choirs and traditional music in the Roman Catholic tradition. For instance, when the Native Guards disbanded, the church gave a mass for the soldiers. When President Lincoln was killed, the priests performed funeral rites. And importantly, when Congress passed the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery throughout the whole country, the church celebrated for 2 days. On Sunday, February 19th, a choir performed the Te Deum as part of High Mass. And the next day, which was Lundi Gras, that they, quote, welcomed all who suffered under the monster of slavery to come throw some dirt on its cadaver with a mass of solemn jubilation. The leaders of the Holy Name of Jesus Church wanted nothing to do with the raucous celebrations, and they implored their congregation to avoid the crowd of frivolous and disengaged people who listened to the pleasant chords of profane music, and instead encouraged them to listen to devoted young ladies who lead choirs in such a remarkable way, so that singing would leave nothing to be desired in our modest church. So before I close, I just want to take a brief moment and talk about the next phase of my research. So far I've talked a lot about music and less about the general cultures of sound in the built environment. I'm looking into things like every night at 9 p.m., there was a 4-pound cannon fired to signal curfew to make sure that all of the enslaved people returned home. And free people as well. There was these sounds of steamboats on the wharves. The sound of the cannon meant something different depending on one's status. And the sounds of the riverfront were often just part of the background noise of civilization. But these are the sounds that make up daily life. And so another thing I want to understand is how New Orleanians took the music and sounds into their daily lives as they experienced the growing city. So for the Civil War era, this includes looking at sites of headquarters and camps for the Native Guards, not just the Toro Barracks. Yeah, here's all the Holy Name of Jesus Church stuff. I'll show you that later. There were also Camp Parapet and Camp Strong, Gentilly Road and up in Carrollton, identified on this map where black soldiers resisted. Now we see these are places where troops are refusing to stand idly by and be harassed when they consider themselves free men. These are the places where the stereotypes of the Black Brigade and the raw recruit were torn away in favor of actual experience. So if you join us next week, I will try to draw lines from these 1860s moments of emancipation through the 20th century to the volatile decade of the 1960s with some stops in between, and talk about the construction of the Claiborne Avenue Expressway and how it forever altered the soundscapes of Treme and the neighborhoods where the descendants of these people who celebrated emancipation lived throughout the 1960s, and many still live today. So thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Wow, the research you are doing is really fascinating, and it doesn't look easy. And actually, my first question, someone just asked this. I wanted to ask this. So I'm going to go ahead and get into some questions here because I have a couple different ones all over the place. Sandra says, I see that Claude Maestri, and I saw that name too. Obviously, the Maestri family, probably some connection right here, sold the Holy Name of Jesus property. Do you know more about his life beyond his role in the famous funeral service for the black soldier? And was it, it was Holy Name of Jesus, and he sold it to what was the person he sold it to?
I can pull up the
deed on the deed.
Yeah.
So that was illegal that he was able to do that.
Right. So Maestri was a Catholic priest, and he was kind of known as a renegade outlaw priest,
Okay.
right? He is very much actively and vocally in support of the formerly enslaved people and trying to bring them into the Catholic fold.
Okay.
But the Archbishop of the city is opposed to this.
Yeah.
Maestri purchases the
You don't have to show it again.
property in 18. Here, I'm just going to pull up.
63 or 64, I think it was, or something like that.
I'm not sure what I put. I mean, I can look at it, I guess, but Maestri purchases the property from Anthony Fernandez, who was an
Okay.
auctioneer in 1863, and sold it to San Leon d'Este in
Right.
1869.
In 1869. Okay, so the map.
Yeah.
Okay, that was because I was like, how is he legally able to sell it to people that would have not been able? Because that makes much more sense. So he sold it in 1869, but he was already that renegade that
Right.
Sam was talking about a little bit
So,
about.
yeah, so there weren't enslaved people who owned this property, and San Leon d'Este was he wasn't an enslaved person either. Even in 1869, he wasn't formerly enslaved. I need to know more about him actually,
Yeah,
but I know
interesting.
he. Well, I guess I don't know. I don't think he was, but thank you for pointing out that maybe I'm making an assumption there. But yeah, so Maestri established this church in 1863, and he preaches at it and gives services every week, and it lasts for many years, and it becomes Congregation Hall around sometime in the 1880s. And Homer Plessy actually lives next door to this church during the 1880s and 1890s. And so I'm not
Is that
sure.
building still here?
What's that?
Is that building still here?
No, that's one
Okay.
of the things that I want to talk about next week is that all that's wiped away for an
Okay.
on-ramp.
Yeah, that'll be very interesting, but not too much fun to talk about. But they have restored, and there's some buildings that have stayed, like in the Armstrong Park area. And I think the PRC
Of course.
just did some. So luckily there were some that have been saved and stuff like that, but they're few and far between. You mentioned the Tribune had an article in 1865, I think it was.
Right.
That was the oldest black newspaper. Do you remember what year it was founded?
I believe it started publication around January 1864.
Okay, so this is very early on that
Right,
they
and that's Charles Louis Roudinet. I know his descendant Mark Roudinet is doing a lot of work with the history of the Tribune. Um, uh, I think there are Roudinet brothers who found the paper, and then it kind of splits, and you start to get the New Orleans Republican and the Louisianan come out. Um, yeah, so that's very early on, and then Freeman of Color from
Okay.
Belgium. Yeah,
Free Men of Color from Belgium. Okay.
right, right.
Okay. So they would have gotten their friendship. I mean, their not their friends, their freedom before they got here through the Belgian colony that they were in, or something like that.
They were men of color who lived as white men in Belgium and
Oh, in
came
Belgium.
to New
Okay,
Orleans during the war. Yeah.
fascinating. Um, all right. You showed the picture of the Toro Barracks.
Yes.
I mean, that's a pretty significant building.
Yeah.
That is just completely gone.
Completely gone. It burned
I had
down
never seen it before, but I mean, that
September
was like,
1865.
yeah, that is a really amazing building there.
So Richard
Anything
Campanella has
about
a
it?
great article, as you know, he's got articles about everything about it's the Gothic castle in the Bywater. I think that's the title of it. And he goes into a little bit of the history. And there's this one picture of it burned that there's a McPherson photo that's at LSU in Hill Memorial Library. But I tracked down these other two photos in the National Archives. The After the war, when there was the investigation to determine how the building burned down, um, the Secretary of War, or sorry, the Senate subcommittee investigating this asked the Secretary of War to get information about it. The Secretary of War wrote to the mayor and said, "Can you give me all the information?" And the mayor included these two photographs in his parcel to the Secretary of War, which were then submitted to the Senate. And so now they're in the National Archives. And as far as I know, they've never been pulled out since the 1860s.
All right, you found it.
I'm waiting on digitization, but those are my little cell phone snaps from sitting in the
Oh,
archive.
really? Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
That's one of those Vatican library moments for you right
I
there.
love it. That's right.
Uh, Sandra says, what places in New Orleans would the contraband have been performed?
It's a great question, Sandra. There's a lot of music halls going on in the city these days. Masonic Hall was a big one on St. Charles, the Academy of Music that I mentioned. But there's also dozens and dozens of saloons and other music halls, just the clubs of the city, in other words. Um, I think one thing I need to do is get a good long list of music venues. I don't have a full list at the moment, but that's a good idea.
Um, Ellis says, all right, this is interesting here. The small white building in front of the ruins of the almshouse is the current location of Beanlandia,
But okay,
which is on the
the Red
corner
Beans
of
headquarters.
Piety and Royal. Is it Charters or Royal? Royal and Piety Street is Beanlandia. Piety and Royal, yeah.
Yeah, so this is facing Charters, or yeah, facing Charters here.
Okay.
So there's
Fascinating.
the burned. Here's the backside of the building. I didn't quite get to that one.
See, basically, it's a report of just this is what the building looked like, and this is what the building now looks like.
Right. There was a before photo and an after photo was what the mayor sent.
And Sanchez, because you see the levee wall in the first photo.
Correct. Exactly. That's the levee wall.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
We've definitely upgraded levees. That's an improvement. That's saying something.
So this was supposed to be an almshouse for the elderly, you know.
Got you.
And then when the war ended, it was unfinished, and the army requisitioned it, and the black troops went in, finished out a few floors of it, and made it the barracks and the quartermaster's depot.
And do you think there was anything nefarious between what happened?
Yeah, I do. I included a few quotes, but reading the full documents, all the testimony of the troops, you know, uh, they were harassed pretty viciously, and there were also children who would sneak in the fences and climb up in the unfinished areas of the building. But it's also unclear because James Ferret, who designed the building, testified that the ventilation they were using for the cooking stoves should never have been used for ventilation. That was the heating and cooling ducts that he had. I don't know if he designed it, but had designed and installed, and so they were too narrow of a gauge to accommodate hot smoke. But even in the crowd, the night of the fire, members of the Second Maine, which was a white regiment who were using it as a barracks as well, it was said the boys of the Maine were said the beans burned the building, and everyone was joking about the beans firing the building down. So it's a mystery.
It's probably something, it's some truth in all of those things.
Yeah.
And we have a similar building to that right now at the Navy Yard complex in that neighborhood.
Yeah.
It's so very similar. Ella says, okay, Beanlandia would have been behind the almshouse. And then
Yeah.
Sandra says, and a railroad track ran through the block. So I think everybody is really enjoying how the details you are getting. I did have one technical wonky graduate student question.
All right.
When you are like the music that you were playing, are you literally taking like, are you finding the sheet music of the time that would have been available to you of New Orleans, and then are you having you or somebody else is playing that music, and so then you
Right.
can then recreate that sound and record it on your own?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So
That's a lot. That's a very time intensive uh, uh, set of research there.
yeah, I'm trying to bring a lot of things together. You know, speaking of grad school, I have a master's in music and a master's in history. Then I got a PhD in history, so I'm in both worlds, and this whole idea of rival soundscapes is my desperate attempt to bring my worlds together, so I can stop feeling so crazy all the time.
No, you're doing it, and I appreciate it. You know, I'm looking, and honestly, when you mentioned you started talking about what happens next week, I just started thinking of like the sounds of the music that is from that era. But then at the same time, you mentioned the fact that the civil rights movement was also happening at the same time. So you're also talking about not only just music playing on the street and kids and stuff out on the corner and stuff. I mean, on the stoop and stuff like that. You're also talking about protest and meetings that happen. And so I'm really looking forward to next week and learning more about how you're gonna kind of meld all this together into the 20th century.
Thank you. I am too. I'm still working on that talk for next week, so
I'm very confident. I'm very
I
confident.
think it's going to come together nicely.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for being here tonight. For you that aren't here on here live, about 30 of y'all, I will email you in the morning and you'll get the recordings. And Greg, thank you so much for your lecture tonight. Really, really another great lecture. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Thanks y'all for coming. Thanks for these great questions and the great discussion. Thank you, Jason. I'll see you next week.
Yeah, great questions from everybody. Yep, we'll see everybody on Tuesday. Thanks, Greg.
Au revoir.